Brown from TUG. I want to welcome you to the first in our series of training webinars. Training as a topic has been one of the challenges that we hear consistently. Always something that people ask for as a topic at our meetings. I've seen it pop up on the forums from time to time. I know that it's a challenge for most of us out there. So to start off with, we've got two presenters today. I'm going to turn it over to Della. Now, Della she's a board of directors member. She's the network leader. Many of you probably already know Della. She also has a day job at Distributors Corp of America. So, but she's also one of the people that was fundamentally responsible for coming up with a concept for these webinars. So Della, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Gary. I want to welcome everybody to the first in a series of webinars focused on training. Training is one of those aspects that we all know we have to deal with, but sometimes we don't know where to even start. So what we wanted to do was present you with some hints and some guides. And this very first webinar is really focused around the preparation for training. What are the things that you need to be thinking about as you get ready to train? Then, as we further down the road, we're going to talk more about some of the details, like what are some of the tools available? What are, how do you schedule? How do you structure training? So I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Janel Anderson. Dr. Anderson is with Working Conversations. She is a keynote speaker. I'm hoping that you guys have all had a chance to hear her at the TUG. And she is a corporate trainer, so she brings a wealth of expertise and guidance that we really can all benefit from. So take it away, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you so much, Della. So as Della mentioned, I am a corporate trainer, and my first major job out of college was to do training for a software company, and I was the first trainer they hired, and so it was a startup company, and for the most part, I was making things up from the ground up, and I imagine some of you feel that same way yourself. And now my business has transformed. I now train people to be better leaders and to communicate better in their organizations, and the training principles I'm about to talk to you about with today work in both the software environment and the people environment. So you may find some additional application for those these skills as you think broadly about what the training needs are in your organization. Now, if you have been in one of my sessions before, you know that I like to make things interactive, and so I'd like to start off with a poll, and this poll is it should be showing up on your screen any second now. The question is, what is your level of experience with designing and delivering training programs? And so if you see that poll, you should go ahead and start voting. Maybe you're really good at it, you're just here for a refresher, or you do okay, but only after learning through your own mistakes. Some of you maybe feel like you muddle through, and some say, I'm interested, but I don't quite know where to start. And others of you are going, what? This is about training? Oh my gosh, I'm in the wrong place. And if that's the case, of course, we do invite you to drop off the call, but I think you're probably here in the right place. And I'm seeing the results come in. I'm going to give the poll, maybe 10 seconds or more, because I think I'm still seeing the numbers changing. And then here in just a second, I will close the poll, and you can see what the poll results were. So, all right, I'm going to close the poll to all the attendees now, and you should be seeing the poll results. Are you able to see the poll results?
I am not seeing the poll results.
Okay.
No, there they are. I see them.
There you see. Okay, thank you very
much.
much.
They're up now.
They're up. Okay, so you see that just under half of you feel like you're doing okay, but only after kind of learning through some trial and error, and 25% feel like they muddle through. We've got a 7% rock stars really good at it. They're here to just get some refresher tips, and 21% interested in starting, but kind of don't know where to start. Okay, that is really helpful to both myself and to Della to know where you stand as we share what we know about training with you to help you get started, or for those of you who are either doing okay or really good at it to up your game. So I'm going to hide those poll results and see if I can't get myself back to sharing my slide deck. And if you can, Gary, can you see my slide deck?
Yes, but you're on Della's picture here.
Oh, okay.
So it might just start from the beginning. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, good.
All right. So the first thing I want you to do is I want you to think like a curriculum designer. And now some of you are probably scratching your heads and going, huh, a curriculum designer? What is that? What does that mean? What is she talking about? Well, a curriculum designer in a large company that has a training department and a well-staffed training department probably has somebody who is in the role of curriculum designer. Now, that might not be their only role. They might design the curriculum and then also be the trainer of that curriculum. But even if you don't have a well-staffed training department who's going to take this on, and you are, scrapping it together like I was back at that software company many years ago, you do need to think like that curriculum designer and put the curriculum designer hat on. Now, the curriculum designers, the first thing they do is they come up with learning objectives. And learning objectives are statements that really explain and define the goal of what you're going to be doing in that training program. And a good example of learning objectives would be when Gary first sent out the email about this course, about this webinar, there were about 5 or 6 bullet points. Now, those are the learning objectives that I'm using and the learning objectives that Della is using to structure the content that we're sharing with you here today. So if you're curious about what learning objectives look like, you could go back to that email after we're off the webinar, and you could look at what those things were that we have you wanting to get out of this session. Now, learning objectives do a number of things. They help you organize your own thoughts and your thinking about the information that you want to share and the content that you want to share. It also helps your participants decide if they need that particular training. Because again, many of you read what the description of the webinar and those 6 bullet points, and you thought, do I need that, yes or no? And that was what prompted you to sign on to this webinar. The learning objectives are also very useful to help a participant get their mind around where you're planning on taking them and what they will be learning. You can kind of think of those learning objectives as a roadmap of sorts that are really going to help people not only decide if this training is right for them, but also help them understand where you're going with them once you get into the training. All right, so with that primary responsibility of the curriculum designer in mind, you want to think, what are the desired outcomes? What do I want to help people learn in the training program? And again, those end goals, those ending things are going to be your learning objectives. But as you work backwards from those learning objectives, as you design your curriculum, you'll want to think, what comes before that final outcome? What steps need to happen to get from A to B, or A to done, A to Z, if you will. So let's say, for example, you've got an e-commerce platform and you want your marketing person, let's say you're in IT and you've now added e-commerce to your suite of tools that you're using, and you'd really like your marketing person to upload all the product information, the product name, the SKU, the description, the price, the photo, and all of that stuff. And if you want to hand that over to that person, it's best to do that with some structured training so that they aren't just winging it and kind of messing things up, but that you're stepping them through it in a logical process. So if you've reverse engineered the steps that need to happen, then you can walk with them through the process, starting with that big picture in mind, the learning objective. We're going to teach you in this module how to upload all of the product content and marketing information, including the photo and so on, that needs to go into our e-commerce system. And so in a situation like that, you'll be starting with, it'll be very much a step-by-step sequential process. And of course, in a system like that, there may be, you could go 1 or 2 different ways. You could enter the SKU first, or you could enter the product name first, or you could enter the photo first. But there's probably a desired process in which it makes most sense. So you will have thought through that and structured your training very much step by step. Now, as you think about designing materials for training, I want you to think that those materials are going to be used both in that training session when you've got people, in real time, walking through the process and learning it for themselves. But then those materials are also going to be used after the fact, when that person goes back to their desk and tries to do it for real for the first time. So as you design those materials, you want to be thinking of both of those use cases. In my training class to walk them through it step by step, and then what will they need when they get back to their desk to do it on their own and do it independently. So, you know, that step-by-step process, it might have the materials they need or login information and then screenshots, and those screenshots might have arrows and call-outs on them and things, you know, ways that you've kind of dressed up the screenshots so that they can really get through the process on their own after they're back to their desk. Now, one other thing that a curriculum designer thinks about is, what does the flow of the class look like? How long is the session going to be? Is this a 60-minute session? Is this a 3-hour session? How long is it going to be? And what are we going to accomplish? And how am I going to keep them engaged during that time? And so I make something like this. So this is like sort of my game plan that I have behind the scenes that I'm using to structure what's happening in a session that I'm developing. Now, this happens to be, I just grabbed one that I facilitated recently, a 3.5-hour training class on team communication. And so you see in the concept column, that second column, those are things that are going to map pretty directly to my learning objectives. Now, I don't have the learning objective written out there. This is just my shorthand for what we're doing in the class. And then you'll see on the right-hand side where I've got the different kinds of activities that I want to do with them to help lock in the learning objectives in the learner's mind or in the participant's mind. So I'll list out my concepts first, and then I'll start thinking through what's a good activity that's going to help the participant learn this concept. And over on the left-hand side here, I've got a handful of bullet points of some different types of activities that you might use for the different concepts. You know, it could be lecture. I mean, certainly in a training situation where you're teaching somebody how to use a piece of software, or to go back to the example I was using earlier, how to have the marketing people enter the e-commerce information on your products on your e-commerce platform. Certainly a demonstration is going to be a huge part of it. Simulation, you might be using simulated data. You might get to a point where after teaching them kind of some of the step-by-step, you just give them a case study or a situation that says, here, you've got this new information to enter, and you don't give them a highly structured format, but this is almost a test or a trial of whether or not they can remember how to apply the steps, because you're just giving them a chunk of unstructured data, and they have to use it sort of as a case study to figure out how to complete the task. Some learners, and we're going to talk about learning styles here in a minute, but some learners are going to learn much better if there is some component of discussion, whether that's large group discussion or turn to your neighbor and talk about something. Likewise, some folks are going to learn better through some reflection of their own, taking their own notes and thinking through things on their own. And then integration, where you're tying different pieces and different steps together. And then again, some learners are going to learn best through Q&A. Now, I'll go through and think about my learning objectives and the concepts that I'm meaning to teach through those learning objectives, and what activities are going to best support that first. And then once I have those two steps figured out, and if you look at my team communication grid, you'll see that now I'm going to add the timing. So first I want to figure out what I'm doing, and then figure out how much time do I have to spend on that. Now, like for example, you'll notice in my class here, the first thing, objectives and introduction, we're going to go through the learning objectives, and then I want to introduce people to each other. And these are presumably people who don't know each other, who don't know each other well. Now, in a class like team communication, I need to build strong relationships, and I need to build them rapidly so that my simulations that come later in the class can operate as much like real team situations as possible. So I'm spending a full 20 minutes doing those introductions, and you know, I quickly run through my course objectives. Again, like you, they knew what the objectives were when they signed up for the course, so we didn't have to spend a whole lot of time on that, but I run through them real quickly, and then I dive in deep with those introductions. Now, most of you probably won't do that because that won't be critical to what people are learning. You'll go into the steps and the nuts and bolts of what you want them to learn more quickly. So I just wanted to give you an example of what kind of the playbook looks like for the trainer. Now, you would have something like this in addition to the training materials that you've created for your participants. And I should have scanned some training materials that I make for my participants, because then I mark them up. So if there's places to write in the answers or places for questions or places, I have my training materials are all marked up with my own notes on them, so that between this playbook and the same materials that the participants have, I've got a full set of notes for myself as a facilitator of that training. Now, there are a few steps that you can kind of think of as shorthand for when you're putting a training program together, and they are this, and these are kind of the fundamentals of training. Tell, show, do, review. Tell, show, do, review. Now, the reason I have a pair of sneakers on this slide is that in my first job as a corporate trainer, remember I started training software for a startup company, and we were growing like gangbusters. And so as the first trainer they hired, I got promoted rather quickly to be a manager. So I was a manager at a young age, and I was hiring additional trainers. And this whole idea of tell, show, do, review is so important in terms of how you structure your training. And so what I would do in the interview when I was interviewing prospective new trainers for our company is I would bring a clean pair, I bought a pair of shoes just for this, a pair of sneakers that I brought to the interviews, and I would ask my interviewees to train me how to tie a shoe. Now, I didn't tell them tell, show, do, review. I just asked them, presume I know nothing about tying a shoe. I'd like to see you train me on how to tie a shoe. And what I was listening for is I was listening for tell, show, do, review. Like, were they going to tell me big picture, here's what we're up to, this is why you need to have your shoes tied, this is the problem that can result if you don't have your shoes tied, and so on. And so I wanted to hear that big picture first, and then I wanted to have them show me or actually demonstrate to me how to tie the shoe. And then I wanted them to have me tie the shoe. That's where I would do. And then when we were completely finished, I wanted them to review the process and step through, here are the steps that you followed to tie the shoe, because that review process really locks it in the learner's mind. So that's, and I'm hoping that since tell, show, do, review kind of rhymes with shoe, that will help you remember it even more. And now let's move on to talking a little bit about tailoring your content to the adult learner's needs. So a child learns in a scenario that's very much teacher-centered, whereas adults learn in a way that in an environment that is very much centered on them rather than on the instructor. So you're going to want to take sort of everything you maybe think about as teacher in front of the room and cast that aside and be thinking about how can you make the steps of your process and how you're thinking about and conceiving of your training program as very much learner-centered. So this is going to be all focused on who are your learners and what are they up to. And with respect to that, I want to talk for a few minutes about why adult learners are different. So adult learners, we want to direct our own learning. We want to be in charge of our own learning. We don't want to be told what we need to know. We want to think that somehow we have personal agency in it. We want to also access our own experiences when we're learning something new and figure out how this new information jives with or perhaps replaces what we already know. Sometimes in adult learning we call that, looking at what's the existing scaffolding, what already exists there that we can hang this new information on. I think a pretty clear example of this would be if you're going through a system upgrade, you might then talk about, here's how you used to do it, or here's how you have been doing it in version 3.5. Now we just upgraded to version 4.2, and here's how these same tasks are going to look in this new version. So for example, again, if you were training on an upgrade. But again, people really want to access their own experiences, and adults want to know what that goal or outcome is. They want to know why. And especially if it's something like, you want to get the e-commerce, you want to get the marketing team responsible for the e-commerce data rather than you doing it for them. They maybe come to you and say, well, why? You used to do all this for me. Why do we have to learn it? So be ready to answer those why questions. So, so that so the marketing department has more control, so the marketing department can make changes faster, so that you can put in the snappy language that's going to make people buy. So be ready for those why questions, okay? The other thing to think about with adult learning is that much different than children learning, kids are sponges. They just soak up all kinds of new information. As adults, we're not sponges. We form habits about the way we prefer to take in information, and are really prevalent in terms of how adults will behave in a classroom environment where you're training them on something. So let's take a minute and walk through. I want to walk through 6 different learning styles. And as we go through these 6 different learning styles, I want you to think about which one of these best captures your own learning style, and then kind of in the background also be thinking about which one of these best captures some of the personalities or the types of people that you might be training as you put together a training program, or for those of you who are already doing some training. So the first one is the visual learner. So the visual learner needs to see things simply, and they need to see. They need to see simple and easy to understand either processes or diagrams, and they want to follow along visually. So this could be a step-by-step of screenshots. You might be showing those screenshots on a PowerPoint presentation, much like we're looking at today, so that people can look at them and follow along. Again, if you've got printed material, and I think you're going to want to have printed material with your training program, those screenshots would be there as well so that people can really follow along. So the visual learner is somebody who is really taking everything in and being very mindful of what they see. So you want to cater to them by creating dynamic visual images, detailed images that are going to be meaningful and help lock the learning in for them. So that is one style. Now another style is the auditory learner. So the auditory learner needs to hear something in order to process new information. So they might prefer a lecture or a read aloud format. Now the auditory learner, you can certainly mix and match these, because oftentimes somebody who is an auditory learner, they're not completely disinterested in your images, but the images are much more prominent, say, for the visual learner, the one we were just talking about, than they are for the auditory learner. The auditory learner really wants to be, engaged in conversation with you and hearing what you have to say. They might prefer to read aloud if you've given them printed material, just because they like to hear it out loud. So that's the auditory learner. Again, a lot of these, you're going to find people who are kind of a combination of one or the other, but most of us have a dominant preference for one of these 6. The next one I want to talk about is the reading-writing learner. So the reading-writing learner processes new information by writing it down. They love to take notes during your session. So they will, if you give them a handout, they will mark that session up with notes all over the place. Now, they might never go back and look at those notes. It's the act of writing down those notes that helps them remember. If you think back to college, and if you took a lot of notes in college, maybe you didn't study those notes when you went to take an exam, but if you wrote down a lot of information in class and really liked to, the act of writing helps solidify that new learning, then you maybe would recognize yourself as a reading-writing learning style being dominant for you. And the next one I want to talk about is the logical learner. And the logical learner learns best by solving problems. They like to do a lot of reasoning, and they're likely to want to analyze things, look for cause and effect, solve problems, and generally they like to think through concepts that are being taught in order for them to best understand them. So they need some time built into your training curriculum to actually do this thinking. And if you're rushing through from step to step to step and then from task to task to task, the logical learner may not get fully what they need from your training programs. You need to create some time build some time in there for that logical learner to process that information. Now, your social learner likes to discuss the concepts with others, and they really need to discuss those concepts with others in order to learn, in order to lock it into long-term memory. They may prefer discussion. So that discussion could be the type where you turn to your neighbor and share, what we often refer to as a pair share in the training world, or it could be sharing out with a larger group, and maybe it's a combination of the two. Turn and talk to your neighbor about what questions you might have, or what you think of this new process, or what stumbling blocks you ran into, and then share those ideas out with the larger group. So that's what your social learners are, that's what your social learners need. Now the kinesthetic learners, these folks learn best through movement or interacting with the material. So now here is where we might think about the step-by-step process. So if we're talking fingers on the keyboard, using a dummy set of data to actually do those step-by-step, as opposed to just talking about them or having somebody else demonstrate them for us, so here's where your kinesthetic learners are really going to shine. Now, I use kinesthetic learning in a different way when I'm training on, say, team communication or group dynamics, those kinds of things. I will have literally people getting up and moving around the room. But in a software training environment, kinesthetic learner is more about interacting with the software. And so here's where you've got training exercises and role plays, or in this case, dummy data, where people can actually be entering things into the system and learning it that way. So those are the 6 different types of learning styles. So if you recall, I asked you to think about which one of those learning styles do you think best fits who you are. And so I'd like to ask you now, through a quick poll, which one of the learning styles is the best description of the way you think you learn, just based on what you know about yourself. And while we wait for those to come in, I just want to say, at a minimum, it's useful for you to know that your own preferred learning style. Your preferences will influence your delivery method. And as you think about the fact that there are these 6 different styles, you might be thinking about how you can make sure you're hitting those different styles as you are developing your training material and delivering that training material. And let's see, we've had the poll. We've got, I'm going to leave the poll open for just a few more seconds before I show you the results. We're at 76% of the people who are on the call have voted. So we'll give it just another minute or two. Now, you'll notice that we have social and kinesthetic together on this, and that's only because the webinar platform would only allow us to give you 5 options instead of the full 6 options. So I'm not really sure how that those last 2 break out. But I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now. We've got about 87% of the people voted. And so you should be able to see the poll results now. 31% visual, only 4% auditory. Can you see those results? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So 23% reading, writing, 15% logical. They like to puzzle through things, and we've got a combined 27% with our social and kinesthetic learners. So you can kind of see, I mean, this is a nice distribution, because as you can see, even from this, that we're, as a group here on this call, we're distributed in the different types of ways that we like to learn. And so this, this is a good representation, perhaps, of the group that you might have in your audience. Even though we've only got 4% who are auditory, and we're presuming that would be auditory only, but still a good mix is going to help make sure that you are meeting the needs of your learners, and also making sure that you've got everybody's needs met. All right, so hopefully I closed that and you can't see those anymore. Well, I want to talk for just a minute or two before I turn it over to Della about whether or not you're going to do your presenting in person or online. Now, it's always best when you can bring people together and do that in-person training, because when you're doing that face-to-face training, you can answer a lot more questions in real time. You can help the people who seem to be stuck or confused, and you can do that a lot more dynamically. Now, here what I mean by online training is training that is delivered, say, for example, through a live webinar type situation like what we're doing right now. And if you're training on software, gosh, it's just so hard for people to be doing what they're doing on presumably one monitor or one computer, and then following along on another computer or another monitor and switching back and forth. So right there you've got that as a barrier between you and some really good learning with those folks. You've also got the challenges of people, getting disrupted and feeling distracted while they're in an online learning environment. And some of you, even right now on this webinar, have probably been tempted to check your email, or you got a text, or you got something that drew your attention away from the webinar whether it was for just a second or two or even a few minutes. And so you want to think about that barrier to effective learning that you've got going on as well as you're thinking about, do we do this online, or do we bring everybody together into the same room? One more thing that I want you to think about is if you really are feeling like, yeah, you know what, Janel, we've got this down. I'm pretty sure our people can handle doing this in an online format. Well, here I want you to think about these specific conditions that really must be met in order for online delivery to be successful. First of all, your course has to be very well, like extremely well designed. This should not be the first rodeo for this pony. You really have much material, and your learning objectives are clear. The activities are rock solid. The trainer needs to be extremely tech savvy, because as many of you who've facilitated webinars, and I'm sure you lead online or meetings over Skype and different GoToMeeting and so on, you know that unless the person who's leading that meeting is extremely tech savvy, anything that can go wrong will, and it will really disrupt the learning that people can take away from it. You also have to have no or low variability in the trainer system versus the learner system. So if you're playing with dummy data, or if you've got a system that's highly configurable and it might look different on the trainee's end versus how it looks when you're demonstrating something, or the screenshots that you're showing, that is also going to be something that's going to make it harder for the learners to follow along. The content needs to have very little ambiguity. If there's any way to misinterpret, it certainly will happen probably in your live training session, whether it's in person or online. But if it's online, it's much harder to figure out what that ambiguity is if the screen on the participants in front of the participant ends up looking differently than the screen or the screenshot that you're showing them. Again, like the trainer, the learners also have to be very tech savvy, and the learners have to be comfortable with a certain amount of uncertainty, because in that uncertainty, that is where, again, things can go wrong, and when things can go wrong, they probably will, especially in an online learning environment. So those are my remarks, and I'm about to hand it over to Della. And again, if you've got any questions, you can type them in the question box, and we'll take them at the end. And
we do have a couple of questions that might be good right now.
All right, let's take those.
Well, so one of them is, can I be a combination of learning styles?
Oh, absolutely. And most of us are. Most of us are a combination of learning styles. We tend to have one that's more predominant, and several others that are far less pronounced.
Okay.
And you can expect that of the people who are in your training class as well.
Got it. So David made a couple of comments too. One of them, he said, with online, it's hard to see the whites of their eyes, which is another challenge. And he said also rapid mouse movements can make your attendees a little bit seasick. I know a lot of people do tend to be jumpy with the mouse. So another question came in and said, is there a basic rule of thumb for how long a person in training, a session should last for a person that's in training?
Well, I think it depends upon the training curriculum and how long, and the extent to which you're bringing people together. Like if you've got, let's say, you've got a distribution center that's got 8 different, or you've got 8 different physical locations, and you're bringing people all to one location. You're pulling them away from their day jobs, and maybe they've got to travel some distance, whether it's across town or whether it's from Milwaukee to Minneapolis, and they're then together for a while. I would try to bang out as much training as you can with lots of breaks, because the more brain breaks you can give grown-ups, the easier it will be for them to concentrate and learn more tasks in the same day. So I would plan on having breaks every 45 minutes or so. And I think if you've got breaks, and they don't all have to be 15-minute breaks, but take a quick bio break every 45 minutes, and then every hour and a half they've got maybe a longer break, a 15-minute break, and a decent-sized lunch break. I don't think it's unreasonable to have people together for a full day.
Okay. All right. And one last question. Any unique tips for training new associates that are part of an acquisition?
Oh, when you're training new associates that are part of an acquisition, you've got a number of things going on. You've got the cultural transition, because there's a certain element to which they are tied to the way we used to do it, especially if they are the target company that was acquired. So that I think it's helpful to be really mindful and empathetic towards, there may be some built-in resistance that has nothing to do with you and nothing to do with the software, but the people may, even if it's on the whole, it's a positive acquisition and they're excited about it, there still is likely to be some residual emotional feeling in that. So I think just the more that you can at least be present to it, even in your own mind, even if it's not something that you talk about in the training per se, that you can just sort of hold that space of, gosh, it's even harder for them to learn this because there's this emotional component of it's no longer ABC Corp, it's now XYZ Corp, and I'm not sure that I like this.
Okay, thank you, and that's all the questions.
Okay, we'll hand it over to Della now.
All righty, thank you, Dr. Janel. Can you guys all hear me okay?
Yes.
I can. There was a comment that it seemed like the sound was breaking up. I'm hearing you just fine, though, so it can't be for everybody.
Okay, well,
continue on, Della, and I'll let you know if it's an issue. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. What I wanted to do was spend just a little bit of time talking about two aspects of a training curriculum, if you will. First off is documentation. So my very first job at R&D Systems, I was a technical writer. So doc is really close to my heart. The other thing I want to talk about is probably the hardest thing for me to do, is to measure how effective the training actually was. So let's start with documentation. So next slide. Okay. So documentation, we had gone through a process of giving, reference manuals that said, by function, here's the field, here's how big it was. But it really wasn't focused on how you do your job. And so we changed over to what's called a one-stop doc. And it really comprised of three pieces. It gave the visual pieces that said, here's the screenshots, here's a graph, here's how the workflow for this particular transaction works. It then provided the step-by-step. Click here, enter this information at a field-by-field level. And then it provides also reference information, terms and concepts. A lot of what we forget when we do training is we know what it means, but our students don't always understand what it means. And terms can have multiple meanings. Concepts, whole concepts need to be really explained. And so in the reference, we give terms and concepts, plus as kind of a hint, if you will, of here's a job that I don't do every single day, so I need to go back and I just need a guide on, start here, your next step, step 1, step 2, step 3. I also create kind of a quick step guide. So in the documentation, what I try to do is, one, make it very, 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 very focused. You cannot make it so general that says, this is all of accounts receivable. This is how you apply a check. This is how you apply a COD. And make that one-stop doc very focused. So the next slide gives just a couple of examples. So the first one was, I had created a doc for how to import an Excel spreadsheet into PDEM. There's a number of steps, and there was all these concepts, and it was a new feature for my pricing department. So I started with an introduction, and then below that, I give the terms and concepts. So as I'm writing the instructions of step by step, you're going to encounter these terms and concepts. Then, on the next slide, I have the actual step by step. And you'll notice I do a ton of screenshots. Now, in Windows 10, I use Snap. And so what Snap allows me to do is take a whole shot of an entire screen and then focus on just specific areas so that I'm not giving them this gigantic screen and saying, focus on this one field that's in the lower right-hand corner. I'm able to give them the field. Then, when I go through class, I have them mark this document up. So they circle what they're looking for. They can write in notes. I leave them a lot of white space so that they can write in the notes. So that's just a sample of the documentation that I produce. The next problem, the next issue that I always deal with when it comes to training is how in the world am I going to measure whether or not I did a good job, whether or not the training was effective. So next slide, please. Measuring training can happen in a couple of different ways. So you can sit down and you can watch the person doing their job. You can also have them pass a test. So next slide, please. I have a certification program. So if you put in a certification program, there should be two pieces of the certification program. There should be a written test because they have to be able to define a term or a concept. Now, when I say a written test, I'm not talking essay or anything like that. Most of mine are all multiple choice. But then the other piece of that certification is they have to do hands-on testing. They have to prove that they can get it. They can do that. They have to be able to show me that they can post a check to cash in cash receipts. The other effective way of training or effective way of measuring training is productivity. Now, here's a trick. You have to do it before and then you have to do it after. And sometimes that's not always easy to do. So we've done a couple of things. In our accounts payable, one of the things that we do is we track the number of invoices that are entered. And I can do that by pulling out and creating a report that says, in this journal, I have X number of sets, and every set equals an invoice. So I can create a report that says, before we did training, here are the number of invoices that we put in a day. After a day or so of getting used to that and getting, and practicing, then we do the measurement again to see if the training was effective, if they were able to improve that productivity level. Now, you can't do it with everything. So some of it is going to be kind of a gut feeling of, yeah, they're faster. They're able to answer more questions. The other method is based on support. So in the IT department, I have my help desk. And so based upon the questions coming through to that help desk, I'm able to kind of determine, one, where I need training, but two, I can see if my number of questions in that topic start to decrease, if my number of questions from a specific person start to decrease. So I can use my support tool to look, once again, before and then measure with the measurement afterwards. And so some of this, if you don't have like a party or a product like Zendesk or anything like that where you actually record your support, you'll need to create a spreadsheet. And I know it's kind of laborious, but the spreadsheet will give you an idea by topic and by operator who needs the training, what areas they need the training, and then to be able to measure, after you've done that training, measure how effective it was. So that's all I had. I just wanted to talk a little briefly about that, and then also to remind you, there's going to be more webinars coming up because we need to get into more of the details and really focus on how do I plan this and what are the tools available. And if we need to, if you let me know, we can have another training on more details on how do you document. Okay? And that's all I had.
Thank you, Della. That was great. I don't see any questions coming in right now, but now would be a good time. And then also, if you have a question you want to speak about it, you can raise your hand, although I don't see anybody with their hands raised either. Della, we should probably mention that as part of this ongoing thing, I think we're looking to maybe do some case studies with TUG members that have successful training programs going. And so we'll be reaching out and asking for people who might be willing to do a presentation. And if anybody's on this webinar and you're doing an effective presentation and you want to help participate, we would very much like to talk to you about it. So.
Absolutely. And what we are looking for, what we would love to hear is case studies for people that have formal training departments and case studies from people that don't. the majority of us, there's a lot of us, I don't know if it's a majority, but there's a lot of us that really don't have a formal training department. So we want to see, what is working. I'd love a case study on both.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay. So I don't see any other questions. I think we can wrap this up. Dr. Anderson, do you have any parting comments?
I would just say go forward with the learner in mind and try to structure it around what their learning needs are, and and mix up your methods so that you get all your different learning styles hit.
Perfect. Well, Dr. Anderson and Della, I want to thank you very much for the presentation today. This is a great webinar. We greatly appreciate the work that you put into making these presentations. And with that, I will just say everybody have a great day, and we'll see you at the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.